there's a lot of injustice in this world. But I think some of the hardest things to watch is when a child is being neglected or abused. People often cry out, "Where's God? Doesn't he care?" In today's episode, we'll answer those questions and more as we hear from C.A.S.A volunteer Grant Tolbird.
Hey guys.
He's the husband of a previous guest, Danielle Tolbird. Back in season 1, I had a wonderful conversation with Danielle about anxiety. And if you missed it, you should definitely go back and check it out. It was super awesome. And I thank her for that. But today we're here and we're talking with Grant, wonderful Grant, and he's going to talk to us about what it is to be a C.A.S.A volunteer and how God used the experience to stretch and grow him. So Grant, thanks for coming out today. I know that I've had the honor and privilege of being a C.A.S.A volunteer, but I know that many listeners out there are probably like, what is C.A.S.A? I mean, I thought it was just a Spanish word for house. So can you help everybody learn what is C.A.S.A? What are we talking about? No, we're not speaking in Spanish today. What are we doing?
So the first time I heard it, I thought it was a Spanish organization as well. But C.A.S.A stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate. It's where a judge in your local area appoints a person to look out for the welfare of a child in foster care. So as a C.A.S.A, you get to know the child, form a relationship with the child, and love the child. Often you are the only constant in the child's life, and as they bounce from foster home to foster home. And so your job is to love that child and care for that child.
And be on the lookout for their best interest. I remember that was one of the things honed into me during my training time for that. So how did you learn about this organization?
Yeah. So Danielle had heard about it, and I'm not sure who she heard about it from, but she had been talking about it for a few months before I really gained an interest in it. And I remember telling her that this is something that maybe God's calling you to do, but
maybe you should do that.
Yeah, maybe that's for you, but that's not really for me. You know, I'm not great with children, and so she was telling me about this. I was like, okay, that does not have me written all over it. It sounds a lot like Danielle, but not a whole lot like Grant.
Yeah. But it sounds like she's kind of prodding your heart for a while there, since I guess she's talking to you about it for a few months. So it sounds like you have some reservations. I know you talked about some, like the children and being involved with them, not really so much your thing. But what changed your mind?
So First West actually had a seminar or during one of their sermons where they had a C.A.S.A representative come up and talk about what it meant to be a C.A.S.A and what all it was involved. And during that sermon, and for a little bit of background, I had been praying for months for God to show me a way where I could serve him in his kingdom. You know, I was an adult now. I had an adult job. I was out of college. And so I had been praying for a while that I didn't have the excuse of, well, I'm just a poor college student with no money. I need to be able to do something to further God's kingdom. And I've been praying for months about that. And then during that sermon, I felt a very clear call that this is what I was supposed to do. So that's how I became a C.A.S.A.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Don't you just love how First West does that? We're both members there at First West, and they do that from time to time. They just kind of pull people up or different organizations up that are kind of happening around the area, and they just kind of put a microphone on their face and get them to talk about it. And I love it. I love it because to me, I'm like, that's a podcast. That is a live podcast right there. And so you never know when you share stuff like that, how people will respond. And I think that's awesome that you felt that, you felt that call for you. But can you tell us what that felt like, and how did you know it was God calling you? I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I felt a very clear conviction to become a C.A.S.A, and it was something that I would say is within God's character, but that I would never decide to do for myself.
Yeah, often goes that way. But what do you mean by that? So what do you mean by it being God's character, and how is it not being something that you would do work into that?
Sure. So I had been reading around this time period through the Old Testament, and there was a constant theme, especially in the major and minor prophets, of when God was condemning the people of Israel for not following him and not obeying his commands. Towards the very top of that list, every time was, you have neglected the widows, the orphans, and the poor. And constantly, and through the book of Hosea, Micah, God was talking about how much he cared about injustice. And so that had been resonating with me for a while.
Yeah.
And then as I felt that conviction, I knew from talking with Danielle about C.A.S.A that it was going to be a very sad situation.
Yeah.
I was going to be around these children and get to love them, and that it was going to be hard and sad. And I did not want to put myself through that. But when I felt that conviction, I knew that because I did not want to do it, but that is something that God had called his people to do. That meant he was calling me to do this.
Yeah. He's kind of like that. I guess standing before Jonah, saying, Jonah, I know you don't want to go to Nineveh, the very sinful city over there, but I want you to go anyways.
Exactly.
So, yeah. I've kind of experienced those times as well. Like, it's kind of those moments where like, it's like, actually sometimes that's the tippy moment, like knowing that it's not something you would do. It's like, oh, it's probably God, because it's not me naturally. And like God's who, God's the one that stretches us in those moments like that and helps us grow. So, yeah. Okay. So you went through training and you're assigned a C.A.S.A case. Like, how did that go?
Yeah. So another instance where later on, when I was starting to question, did God really call me to do this? I would reflect on this moment and it would remind me. So Danielle and I went through about a 6-week training course, and they do a really good job of getting you ready and letting you know all the things that might come your way. And we got sworn in by the judge, and within 10 seconds, we hadn't even got a chance to go to get snacks or sit down. The people that had been leading our training course, came up to Danielle and I and said, we think we have a case for you. You don't have to take it if you don't want to, but there's a family, it's 8 children. They just got removed from the home. They're in about 4 or 5 different houses, but we think y'all would be great for this. And Danielle and I did not commit in that moment, but we kind of looked at each other, and on the drive home, we're like, okay, God's calling us to this case. Yeah. It's very clear that he's calling us to this specific case. And so whenever we started getting involved, we found out the children were usually all separated from one another. There were several times over the course we were involved in this case where they were in 8 different homes, all throughout different parts of the state. One of them would be in Tallulah. Another one would be in Atchafalaya. They were just all over the place. And over the course of this case, we saw every form of abuse. We saw physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, sexual abuse. And we were often the only ones who knew anything about this type of abuse that was going on, and the only ones who were in a position to try to stop it.
Man.
And at times it got incredibly overwhelming. And sometimes I would talk with Danielle and say, I don't think this is ever going to get better.
Yeah.
It felt like it would never get resolved and that the children would never be able to find a sense of peace.
And that's just a lot to take in. I mean, and just even with my experience with C.A.S.A as well, like it is, you see some tough things and it's a little, you feel a little hopeless a little bit. Like you're supposed to be in there being, their buffer, and you're like, but am I really doing anything? So I get that for sure. I just want to point out, because I know a lot of people probably don't understand, like when doing your training, you're told as a C.A.S.A, you have to physically put eyes on your C.A.S.A children at least once within every 30 days. If you got 8 and they're across the state, how did you and Danielle do that?
Divide and conquer.
Yeah.
So we were very blessed that whenever we first started in this case, Danielle was working from home. And then shortly thereafter, she got a job where she had off every Friday. So she just worked Monday through Thursday. And so she was able to, during the week on Fridays, go and see some of the children. And I was blessed enough in my job that I can take off when I need to. And just in my role as an attorney, I don't really work 8 to 5. I work however long I need to on a specific case I'm working on.
It's a little flex time.
Yeah, a little bit of flex time. So, if I needed to take off during the day to go and sit in a court hearing for one of these children or go and visit one of the children, I had the luxury to be able to do that. But yeah, pretty much every weekend we were driving all over different parts of the state. Yeah. And so when we first started, we were in a duplex and didn't have to do yard work. So that was our version of yard work instead. Yeah, that was our daily ritual on the weekends.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys were able to do it. I think doing it in pairs is kind of a little bit easier because of that. When I did it, it was just me solo, but I think doing it in pairs can come in handy for a lot of reasons. And that's just one of them.
Yeah, that is one of them. And another thing that helped too is sometimes we would go and visit a child and one of us
Mhm.
would pick up on something and the other one wouldn't, or one of us could talk with the child and the other one could talk with the foster parent.
Mhm.
And, there was
Compare
one.
notes sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of, yeah. So going in pairs definitely could be a benefit for a lot of reasons. Yeah. Now, I want to touch on something that you were just mentioning, and I'm like, wow, like I didn't want to interrupt. And I was like, man, like you talked about you guys saw every form of abuse. Like, was that current in the moment? Like, what did you mean by that? Like you saw, all that kind of abuse. Like, what do you mean by that? Like you guys are the only ones who saw it.
Yeah. So part of becoming a CASA is as you love the child, you gain the child's trust.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes you're the only constant in that child's life. The child might be bouncing around from foster home to foster home. They may not see their parents more than a couple times a year while they're in foster care. And as you are the only one who sees that child with every 30 days, the child begins to form a relationship with you and begins to trust you. And so there was a few times where one of the children would just in passing mention some form of abuse. Or one example, there was a time where 3 of the children were finally in one home together, and Danielle and I were very excited about it. They seemed happy. And then over the course of that visit, we realized that this foster parent had double the number of children that she was legally allowed to have in her home.
Yeah.
And she was having a little bit of a racket. And as what we had to report it. And then later on, cops went and arrested her. And then those children got removed out of that home. But we didn't notice it initially, but one of the kids happened to mention how many children were living there.
You're like, wait a minute.
That's a red flag.
Yeah.
And then in terms of sexual abuse, sometimes the children would happen to say something, like one of them mentioned a dream that they had. And at the time, we didn't think much of it, but it was a bit of a red flag. And it put us on the lookout. And then later on, whenever we learned about the form of sexual abuse that had been going on, it made more sense. And
was that by like a current caretaker or like from something before, like before they were removed?
So it wasn't the parents, but that's a long story.
Okay.
So it had been going on. Yeah, it had been going on for years.
Okay.
But
okay. Yeah. That's just why being a CASA is so important, because, that's the whole point of CASA. Is to be there, catch the in-between, because the social worker, they're really there to support the biological parents, to help them work their case plan to reunification with their family. But the CASA worker, you're there for the child to be there on their behalf and kind of let them know that they are seen and heard, and kind of see like what is their best interest from their perspective. What did they want? Because before then, how they teach us in training is that without CASA, that's not really represented. A lawyer can only do so much, especially if they're not out there, boots on the ground. And a lawyer can't do all that and do all the other things that they're obligated to do as well. So CASA is extremely needed. And from everything you just described, that's why to see that, to catch that, because there's only so many people, all the other parties can do. We need more people out there to see those things.
Yeah. And with the Department of Children and Family Services, which is
Mm-hmm.
the organization that has social workers involved.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that Danielle and I realized that there are some great social workers out
Mm-hmm.
there, and they care about those children and they do everything that they can. And then there are some that don't. And
Mm-hmm.
even the ones that are great, they have so many cases that
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times they just physically are not able to pick up on everything that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And they're constantly getting burnt out and taking on a different type of job. And so there were so many social workers that we got assigned to different children throughout the course of the case. And at the very end, in the last year or so, there was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful worker who loved those children, and she was phenomenal. But that first about year and a half is kind of rough going. We really couldn't rely on the social workers to be able to pick up on some of these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just like there's just so much, like you're just saying, because like the social worker I had for my case, like she had told me like I think they're only supposed to have like 10 cases, and she had double that amount. She had like 21. That's a lot to go out and see and be responsible for, and not just for the children, but for the biological parents as well. So it's really great to have CASA where your only responsibility is to, focus on the children and what do they need. It's definitely a needed thing for sure. So what else did you encounter during this case? You know, I know there's a bit more to it than that for you guys.
Yeah. So I grew up rather sheltered and privileged, if I'm being honest. Danielle grew up, she was raised by a single mother. And so she grew up poor for a while. And so for me, like the very beginning of the case, it was a shock just to see people living in poverty. I had never really seen that in person before. My experience on it was just watching TV. And for me, it was a bit of a shock to see that. And Danielle was unfazed, and we would go into some of these houses that had a ton of people living in this tiny little house. And I'd leave and I'd be like, well, like, oh my gosh, like that seems unsafe. And Danielle would be like, oh no, they just, they're just, they don't have, two incomes coming in, like that's okay. For me, like I learned a lot about where I was privileged and like where some of my blinders were. But mostly I struggled with seeing the children in pain. And again, your job as a CASA is to love these children and look out for their welfare. But part of loving them, especially these children in foster care who've been removed from their homes, they're in a constant state of pain. And there was some of the children that we had ended up in wonderful foster homes and were in those foster homes the entire time, had great foster parents who loved them and did a great job with them. But most of them would bounce around from home to home. And we can remember going and seeing one of them and the child begging us to take her away because we were the only constant, and she kept begging us. And we, as CASAs, you cannot take the child away from the foster home that they're in. And so having to tell the child, we legally cannot take you away, having to go and visit a child in the hospital because they had expressed suicidal ideations, having to go and visit a child who had been arrested. And, it just, we were constantly seeing the children and different types of pain. And I struggled because I did not understand why God would put us in that position. And I knew God had called us to be CASAs, but that was something I really wrestled with is why is God having me do this if I'm not having any impact?
Yeah. It's definitely hard, especially when it's kids involved, because you feel like they're just so innocent. Why are they having to, suffer with this, and
at least I can't speak for Danielle, but I felt so helpless throughout large parts of this case. It felt like I wasn't able to do anything. Like I could see what the children were going through. We could, call the authorities or call the Department of Children and Family Services. But it felt like there was nothing we could really do to fix the situation. If they were removed from a home, oftentimes they were put in a worse home. Or if they were in a good home, something would happen and they would get taken and put in a bad home. And it just, every time something would go wrong, it seemed like it'd never get better. And then something would get better. And then two things would go wrong.
One step forward, two steps back.
Yeah.
Well, how did you deal with that? I just know that was just a lot. How did you deal with that, Grant?
So we were blessed that our young marrieds pastor at the time, Nathan Newfang, he was someone I could trust. And at one point I'd reached out to him and said, hey, we get lunch together? I need to talk about this. And so we met up and I started telling him about what all we had been going through. And I asked him why God would put me in this place when I was having what it seemed like from my perspective, no impact on these children at all, not helping. And it felt so senseless. And the way that Nathan explained it to me is that God sometimes calls us to experience the pain and injustice that he sees every day so that we can become more like Christ by loving others and seeking justice. And again, that reminds me of throughout the Old Testament, when God is telling the people of Israel, you should have cared for the orphans and the poor. God isn't just saying that because it's on a checklist of things that you're supposed to do. God's saying that because he loves those people and he cares about them. He cares about injustice. He hates to see injustice in the world. He hates to see the poor being afflicted and the orphans being neglected. And we are his hands and feet, as we say. And so God is calling us, or at least he was calling me in this case, to care for those children and to love them, to experience that injustice and to feel that same pain that he feels. And so that helped to change my perspective on it. And after that conversation, lots of other really bad things happened in the case. It's not like everything got better after that, but my perspective on it really did change.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad Nathan said that. It's definitely some wise words there, but it's like, God wasn't doing anything. He sent you. Like, you were there. And that whole situation just makes you think of, like, in Psalms, where it talks about, where God is near the brokenhearted, Psalms 34, like, God does care. He was there, and he sent someone, first of all, to think of having C.A.S.A. and put that in place, and then he sent you and Danielle to be a part of that. He was there. He does care. Even if it's just holding their hand. I mean, that's a big deal, because sometimes that's all you need. That's all you need for your hope. So God so cares, and he sent you there. I'm glad you answered that and felt that, because you could have just ignored it, and you didn't.
I had also just read the book of Jonah. So
yeah, don't be Jonah. See, Jonah, he got on a boat, went the other way, and that did not turn out well for him.
Basically, God was like, okay, we're going to do this the hard way now. And so you're still going to do what I'm telling you to do, but now it's going to be the hard way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm glad that didn't happen. And that, you and Danielle kind of saw it through. It's awesome. So what else happened with the case,
Yeah. So there was a number of low points, but for me personally, probably the lowest point was when one of our kids was arrested, had been sentenced to serve several years as an adult, despite the prosecutor had recommended that the child receive therapy. Danielle and I, as C.A.S.A, had recommended that. So most people had been on board, but the child still received a lengthy sentence. And whenever that happened and I learned about it, I was actually with the child's parents at the time. And when I stood up, my legs actually went numb. And the child's mother actually had to help me stand up, because I was so much in a state of shock. I've been praying for this child for so long, and it seemed like the exact opposite of what needed to happen was happening.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's tough. Like, just what a disappointment, I'm sure. How did Danielle react to that? This
was one of the times where we had to divide and conquer. And so I was able to be there whenever we learned about this, and Danielle was having to work, because this was happening during the day. And so I had to tell Danielle over a text message, which had to relive it as I was typing it back out. She had a similar reaction that I did when she came home, and we had to cry it out together whenever she made it home.
Yeah, man. So how did you handle that letdown? I know that just sounds so huge right there in that moment.
Yeah. So I took the rest of the day off of work. I just had prayed for this kid for so long. And when it looked like his one chance of getting therapy and possibly being able to get a second chance at life, that had been lost, I had this nagging feeling of doubt start to creep in. And when I went home, I actually prayed out loud from the book of Mark. There is one of the people that had come up to Jesus to ask him to heal his son. And Jesus had said, anything is possible for those who believe. And the Father says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And that verse was just swirling around in my head. And so I literally prayed out loud, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. I prayed out loud, and that's not something I normally do. I normally pray silently, but I prayed out loud, and I asked for God to help me trust his plan, because in the moment it seemed like he didn't have one. I asked God to help remind me that he had a plan, and that it was better than anything that I could have come up with.
And that he's still sovereign. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like God puts those verses in the Bible just for those moments like that. Like, I'm glad it happened then, because it still happens now.
Right.
Or we feel that, like, where is God? And feel that hopelessness, but yet he still is there. And I think verses like that, it's just so helpful to have now. Well, was there anything else that helped you? Like, I know that we just talked about Mark 9. Was there anything else that helped or encouraged you during that time?
Yeah. So the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul, was
such
also
a good song.
Yeah, it was also in the back of my head. When it comes to Christian music, I like the praise hymns of today, but for me personally, the older hymns, the words that have been sung about God for hundreds of years, those are the words that really resonate with me. It Is Well With My Soul is one of those that just, especially in that moment, just kind of really helped to be able to push onward.
Yeah. And that song, it is such a special song. Like, it has a really unique backstory, really awesome. Do you happen to know it?
Yeah, I do. So the person who penned the song, before he wrote it, he was on a boat and they were sailing across the ocean. and his family was on another boat, and he had to watch as the boat his family was on capsized and sank. And so he had to watch helpless as his family drowned. And whenever he got to shore, he wrote, "It is well with my soul."
Yeah. And I think the most powerful for me, I'll speak for myself, is like, so whatever my lot, the Lord has taught me to say, "It is well with my soul." And it's just very powerful when you know that person did that in the midst of like immense grief, But man, if he can sing that, then maybe I can sing that too.
Yeah, exactly.
So did God continue to speak to you like you did in the beginning of your journey? And if he did, like, how did you know it was God that's speaking to you?
Yeah, so I didn't have that same like very clear sense of a call that I had at the very beginning. I wasn't feeling happy because we were going through a very tough time.
Yeah, it's very traumatic.
And watching a lot of traumatic things happen. But I did gain a sense of peace about it, that I trusted that God's plan was good, even if I didn't see it. From my perspective, it seemed like a bunch of horrible things were happening. But just to be able to have that peace of knowing that God's plan would carry forward, that what God had planned was better than what I would have come up with or what anyone else would have come up with. And just being able to know that I could trust him and rely on him. And, going back to the hymn, "As well with my soul," and even in the moments of this man writing that hymn, after experiencing that, God was still with him. And that's a lot of what that hymn's about. And Brandy, I know you've heard me talk in class before about the book of Job. That is my favorite book of the Bible. I bring it up constantly. Danielle starts rolling her eyes when I mention it. But one of my favorite parts of that book, which is all about this question of why do bad things happen to good people, Job and his friends are talking about God like he's not there. And there's all these debates about who God is, why would God allow this? And then at the end of the book, God starts talking, and God was there the whole time.
Yeah, I was like, I heard all that.
And God's like, he starts talking and like addressing the points about him that they had been talking about. And God was there with them the entire time. And so being able to reflect on that even in these moments where it seemed like God was absent, knowing that God was there really helped me to be able to trust him.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. And I like that you mentioned peace because, like, I've had a lot of these conversations with people, like asking, like, well, where was God and how did you lean on him and stuff? And time again, I keep hearing that, that theme of like, well, I just felt at peace with him or just peace with what was going on. And I guess to me, that's like a mark of the Christian life is having that peace with us, that when we truly lean into that, that's what we receive. And that's really what our soul wants, And so I guess it must mean something, must mean you're in the right vein or doing something right or, accepting what you needed to accept if that's what you experienced. Because I feel like that's got to be the Christian marker. I keep hearing that over and over again. Well, I heard you mention earlier, like, man, a few years and it's been a minute. Like, how long did this case last? Like, I know how long it lasts, from my perspective, but for my case, but how long did your case last?
So it went on for 2.5 years.
Wow.
And it wrapped up in February of 2020. And so I remember telling Danielle, like, okay, good. Now we can relax a little bit.
Yeah. And then you experience a different kind of drama.
Yeah.
Man, 2.5 years, that's a long time to like walk through trauma with other people,
Yeah, that was, normally they had told us whenever we were taking the training, it probably lasts no longer than 2 years. Ours went longer because the family had more to go through. Again, there's 8 children. And so having to make sure the children were in the right place to go back home, which is eventually what happened. And that the parents were in a place and had made the improvements they needed to make as parents to be able to have their children back at home.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's just a long time, but I'm glad you guys stuck it out. Was there ever a turning point?
Yeah. So there was a couple. So for the child that had been arrested and received a lengthy sentence, there was a big turning point there in that, and even as a lawyer, I'm on the civil side of things. So this dealing with lawsuits and whatnot. I'm not very familiar with the criminal side of law, and I didn't even know this could happen, but the parole board actually reversed the sentence. And again, like,
wow.
I did not know that was a thing that could happen. And I'm an attorney. And so
it's like, wow.
Yeah. So Danielle came up to me afterwards when we learned about it. She said, "Why didn't you tell me that could happen?" I'm like, I didn't know.
Whoa.
It's news to me. But yeah, the parole board had kind of reversed the sentence and mandated that the kid receive the therapy that Danielle and I had been recommending that this child receive for years. And so the child was put into a good place and where he could receive therapy away from his family. And that kind of an outcome was better than anything I had imagined.
Yeah.
And it showed me, one, that I could rely on God and I could trust in him.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also, I don't know, it was kind of affirming or rewarding in a way, in that I had trusted in God. Because there have been other times in my life where I hadn't trusted in him, and then God showed through in the end.
Yeah.
And then I felt a sense of conviction of, well, I should have trusted in him. And I don't know, I guess it strengthened my own faith in God. And even in these dark moments, I was able to trust him when I didn't think I would be able to, and that God was true to the end, as he always is.
Like he was already growing you in that, like, hey, you can trust me.
Exactly.
Awesome. You know, we probably should have covered this earlier, but I forgot to weave it in here. But how did, you and Danielle recommend things to the judge as CASA? Like, what does it look like to be a CASA in the courtroom? Yeah.
So, and they go over this in CASA training, but you write a paper, a brief for the judge to review. And we're very blessed here in Ouachita Parish and Morehouse Parish that Judge Sharon Marchman she's over the family court, and she reads the CASA briefs. Some judges in other places are probably just have too much in their docket to be able to read through it and go over it and with a fine-tooth comb, but she does. I actually had happened to clerk for Judge Marchman whenever I was in law school. So, wow. So that was nice. And don't worry about writing the paper. If you want to become a CASA, they explain to you how to do it.
Yeah, they give really good training. They really do.
Yeah, they do an excellent job of telling you exactly, this is how you write this report. This is the one area where I felt like, okay, like I can do this, because I have to write legal briefs for judges all the time. And so I especially having known Judge Marchman, I had a sense of how to prepare the brief.
One for her, yeah,
in a way that like it would be readable. That's the one thing in law school they actually kind of prepare you for. They don't prepare you how to practice law, but they do teach you how to write things that are readable. And so, we would prepare a brief, and most of the times they're just a few pages, but when you have 8 children,
get kind of long that time.
I think some of ours were like 40 pages. So, but again, that's not normal. That's just because you had 8 children and you had to go through. This one went to this placement and this placement and this placement and this placement.
What happened there for each one of them?
Right.
Yeah. Because I don't think you're required to be at each court hearing, but it is nice to go. I think it shows your support. You know,
and oftentimes the children are there, and so it's a good time to be able to see the children, because you're supposed to see them, like you said, every 30 days. Yeah. That's the time you can do it. And they're in this courtroom. It's not a knock on the courtrooms, but like oftentimes we would have, the court would be held like at Shady Oaks, which is, if you're not aware, that's a juvenile detention center. So it's just next door from
all that
from juvie. And so a lot of these children would go, and like it's right next to the jail. And and you see security guards with guns. You have to go with their metal detector, and it can be really scary for these children. And if you're there as their CASA and they know you and they love you, it can help put them at ease. And so I would encourage you, if you're a CASA, to try to go to those placement hearings if you can, even if you're not required to, so that way the child can feel at ease. Yeah.
So did anything else happen with the case? You're talking about with the one that had the overturn, but what about the other kids? You had 7 other children you guys were looking after. What happened with them?
Yeah. So there actually was a happy ending. And
okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I was shocked when it happened. Danielle and I just did not see it coming out the way that it did. But finally, and to Judge Marchman's credit, she had been ordering that the children receive, and the whole family actually receive therapy as a family the entire time of the case. But there was a lot of hangups with Medicaid and so much of red tape that was kind of preventing it. And finally, that red tape was taken away, and the family was able to receive
what they needed.
Yeah, there was able to see group therapy, and the therapist that was meeting with the family was just wonderful. She was able to get through to the parents, and the parents started making some real changes in how how they
Wow.
parented. I think it actually helped them to be able to have, time as just parents for a while, to be able to form, work on their own relationship. And then the kids were slowly, kind of a couple at a time, reintroduced back into the home. And so it wasn't like from 0 to 8.
Yeah.
It was like, they'd have 2 children, and then about a month later they'd have 4 children. Wow. And I think that really helped the parents as well, and helped the children be able to readjust. And so thankfully we did have that happy ending. The children were able to go home. That was what was best. And the parents were better. And we had told our C.A.S.A representatives and supervisors that if these children ever go back in the foster care, please let us know. We'll drop everything. We'll get back on this case.
Yeah.
And we have not heard a thing since then. So the family's doing great.
Awesome. Awesome. And what a great testament for therapy as well. That's something I feel like in the Christian community, we still don't talk enough about, and just how wonderful of a tool that is. God uses that too. He gives us medicine for our bodies, but he also gives us therapists for our minds. And it's just an awesome tool. And I feel like, wow, what a great testament to that. I'm glad they were able to have that.
Yeah. And I think too, that helped that, as you know, and as a lot of your listeners know, my wife, and she's been going to therapy for years. She really struggles with anxiety. And so therapy is probably not something that I would have thought to recommend for the children on my own, because at the time I'd never been to therapy. And my wife was very early on like, okay, this is a problem. This family needs therapy. Some of these children need individual therapy. And so she had been the big ringleader on that. And I think that was the thing that helped the family put the pieces back together.
Wow. That's awesome. See, that's why you guys had to be in it as a team. Right
exactly.
There. That team duo there. Yeah. Awesome. So did you learn anything about God's character during this time?
Yeah. I learned that before this time, I had grown up very sheltered and privileged, and that there was a lot of pain even and tragedy that we experienced as a fallen world, even here in Ouachita Parish. And just because I had not seen that side of Ouachita Parish and that side of my community, it didn't mean it wasn't there. It just means I had blinded myself to it and walled myself off from it. But God does not have that luxury that I had given to myself. God experiences all that. God knew that this pain was there. God knew that this family was hurting and that this family needed help. And, what I learned is that God experiences this type of pain, that God hurts when he sees children hurting, when he sees his people that love him and people that don't know him yet, whenever he sees them in pain, that he experiences that pain. And like, as Nathan explained, by experiencing that pain that God experiences, I gained a better understanding of God's love.
Yeah, it's huge. So would you say that God does care, Grant? Would you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was just something that really, as I've said before, I just had not seen this side of the community before. And, as a C.A.S.A, you're assigned to this child, and your job is to love the child. And, as by loving that child, whenever they hurt, you hurt. And, I don't have any children of my own. I'm sure that's even more true as a parent. But, as these children were hurting and were begging us for help, just this yearning to just want to just fix everything, and this feeling of injustice. And Danielle and I would sometimes we would just rant for a while in our duplex we were living in about how, like, all the injustice in the world, like, what we were going to do just to fix all this, what was wrong. Yeah. And, God also has that same yearning for these children to not have to experience this pain. But and God can work miracles, but as Christians, we're called to do that for God. We're called to do his work. If you look at what the early apostles did, one of the first things they did as the church started to grow was to collect money to care for the widows and orphans, and to appoint deacons for that. And so this is something that has been going on since the very first days of the church. Yeah. And so being able to play a role in that, of being able to go and care for these children and be able to see what God sees and feel what God feels and go through that pain and love these children as God loves them. It just showed me a completely different side of God that that I knew in theory existed, but I had never experienced.
Yeah,
I didn't ever experienced it personally before.
Yeah, awesome. So, if people want to become a C.A.S.A volunteer, how could they do that? Where do they go?
Yeah. So